I'm so happy to be here with Julian Charrière on the occasion of concentration. My name is Katherine Brodbeck. I'm the Hoffman Family Senior Curator of Contemporary Art. It's my pleasure to introduce Julian. Julian Charrière is a French-Swiss artist based in Berlin whose work bridges the realms of environmental science and cultural history. Through varied media, spanning across performance, sculpture, photography, and video work, his projects often stem from fieldwork in remote locations with acute geophysical identities, such as volcanoes, ice fields, and radioactive sites. To date, his work has explored post-romantic constructions of nature, staging tensions between deep or geological timescales and those relating to mankind. As a former student of Olafur Eliasson and a participant of the Institute for Spatial Experiments, Charrière has exhibited his work in institutions worldwide, including Thyssen-Bornemisza Art Contemporary, Kunsthalle Wien, Musée des Beaux-Arts de Lausanne, Centre Culturel Suisse, Centre Pompidou, Martin Gropiusbau, and Schirn Kunsthalle Frankfurt. As a participant in international biennials, his work was displayed at the 57th Biennale de Venezia, the Antarctic Biennial, 12th Biennale de Lyon, Taipei Biennial, among others. His latest solo exhibition, Towards No Earthly Pole, was shown at Masi Lugano, the Aargauer Kunsthaus Aarau, and the Dallas Museum of Art. Previous solo exhibitions include Mambo Bologna, Parasol Unit London, and others. So this is Julian's bio. As you can tell, exhibited very widely. We're so excited to have his U.S. Museum solo debut here as part of our concentration series. This is actually the 40th anniversary year of our concentration series, so it's a great honor. I'm Katherine Brodbeck, the Hoffman Family Senior Curator of Contemporary Art here at the DMA. Welcome, Julian.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Very happy to be here too.
I promise it's the only time I'll read, but I wanted to give you full credit for all of the great work that you've done. And so I thought actually we would start our talk with kind of the beginning of where we met and the first work of yours that I saw. So I'm showing here a work that was in the Venice Biennial in 2017. So this is Future Fossil Spaces. Here's an installation view in Venice, and then another installation view for Lausanne. And this work was really, I think, the entrance point for me into your work. A really beautiful, I would say, sculptural installation. It exists, on a very, purely formal level in a lot of ways, and I see it, my first entry point too was seeing it as, in this longer dialogue of, postmodern sculpture and thinking of artists like Robert Smithson. But when I learned more about this piece and the site visit that you had done to Bolivia in advance of the creation, I started to understand, much more of the layers of how your research informs this really beautiful formal element. So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about this piece and some of the investigations you were doing around it.
Yes, sure. Yeah, that's nice. That was the piece which actually brought us together in Venice. The piece is called Future Fossil Spaces, and for me, it was a momentum where I think it's a piece which I developed from 2014 and over the past over 2 years from there on. And it was an important momentum because really the beginning of a deeper research into the ground, into what's actually underneath. And I think that what strikes me as an artist is that we actually were living into a revolution, the digital revolution, and everybody kind of start to speak about the expansion of reality, a reality which is somehow ungraspable and which doesn't really have anything to do with our senses, and we were kind of losing ground on the body. And I very early on was intrigued to understand and look at what would be the negative space of the digital world and why no one would really address it. And doing this research, I actually get interested in two different places, one being Bayanobo in Inner Mongolai, which was one open pit in the middle of the steppe where almost 90% of rare earth mineral will be extracted, and the rare earth is kind of one of the key components of electronic devices. And the pendant to this open pit will be lithium production, the Lithium Triangle, It's a triangle between Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. And what interests me the most there is that the three countries were operating in a very different ways. So I actually decided to make a field trip, because a lot of time when I'm engaging with a place, I'm first, gathering information the way I can, and a lot of time my interest and the actuality kind of overlap. And so we were starting to talk a lot about lithium extraction and how these things are happening. And so I decided to take a plane and to go there to experience the place and stand on the ground, which was sustaining kind of mobile revolution of the digital world. And I just took my camera. That's the way I'm normally engaging, and I was hoping to develop a longer, maybe a video or a photographical work, because I was very attracted by the color of the lithium production. There's very specific grade of or shade of green, blue, and yellow, which look absolutely supernatural while look at in situ in the Atacama Desert or the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. But once being there, I went over and do some of my documentation, and then I end up in Bolivia, and I end up very close to one of these family which were actually extracting lithium in their backyards. And what strikes me was that I've been into a lot of mine, and mine is always industrial scale, not really relating to mankind or humankind in a term of again, embodiment. It's huge machinery, and it's something which kind of go over us. But there I was with this family, and they were actually just cutting down the desert with a circular saw and then pumping the remnant of an ancient sea back to the surface, evaporating that, and then collecting the lithium and bringing it to a communal plant. So it was a really family scale business, but a mining business. And also it was about this kind of extraction of resources, and looking at the way they were actually working and learning about the way they were actually working, I also kind of fell in love with the material itself, because as you can see it in the piece, you have really this horizontal stratification, so you can sense somehow how the time crystallized and compressed in something extremely compact and old, but something which somehow also relates to the world I was describing, which is more spreading in every direction without really being touchable, without having being very loose somehow. And so I actually just asked the family if I could acquire the negative space of their production. So it was kind of a mise en abîme of negative spacing, because lithium were creating negative space of the digital world, but I was actually using the negative space of lithium production itself for one sculpture. And then I decided to arrange them in this different installation that you've seen, and really kind of make an emphasis on the strata and the way that the viewer will experience the sculpture, but will also experience a way, a door within the geological time, within this kind of compressed history of the earth. And Future Fossil Space, which is the negative space, fossils is always about kind of underground, the beneath. And in this moment, it's there are spaces which disappear. So if we project ourselves into the future, we need to kind of think about the great unconformity that us human beings are producing. Well, in 200 million years, when one will be in Bolivia or possibly in Pennsylvania or other places of extraction, there will be huge vacant blank spots, which are kind of a sort of loss of memory. And that's something which interests me, that I try to kind of translate in sculptures.
So this work, I think, and your beautiful explanation of it, really carries so many of the themes that our exhibition has, which we'll look at images shortly. But I wondered if you could just speak a little bit more too about something that I heard you speak this morning about kind of scale and how important it is, I think, for us as human beings living in this moment to relate to some of the concepts that you're talking about, which is, both these, vast expanses of geological time, but also the impact of our own actions on what's going to happen in the future. And your artwork is, so evocative of giving a visual manifestation of situating yourself into these immense scale shifts. So I heard you speak a little bit about that this morning in terms of the iceberg, and also something we'll talk about is this, history of romantic landscapes and past visualizations of the relationship between man and nature, but maybe how things have changed in terms of how we're able to visualize our own relationship in this larger, mise-en-scène.
Yeah, I mean, I think that almost the whole show here, 2000 Sleep Poetry, is actually very much focused into this idea of desorientation. So first letting a viewer maybe go blind within one space and then trying to reconnect and recalibrate its own reality to a reality of different agencies. And for me, I think that the Arctic, that's what I was telling earlier, have like this huge potential, the glacial landscape, because somehow they're a door which is easier as a door into the deep geological time is a much easier way as perhaps a stone. So if you have like a stone, and there will be stone in the show, there will be the erratic, but a stone is difficult to relate to because a stone is extremely static, and we barely can think about 50 years in terms of global climate crisis. We're talking about 2100, and it's kind of like the final date, as there would be nothing beyond it, which I think is kind of like completely insane, because the full ecological discourse is kind of limited to this very short period of time. But I think that our action are really kind of like going in two directions, and we are projecting ourselves through our action into time that we cannot understand, but we still actually be there. So being in the present is always about actively kind of like co-producing the past and the future at the same time. And I think that for this extent, we need to kind of understand other temporalities. And in my work, I'm trying to relate a lot to the geological, but in some other piece, I might have been related to the botanical time. But there are time window which let us actually grasp different things and try to find a middle ground or a common ground to address some of the problems. And so the ice, to get back to the show and to get back of why glacial landscape have been very influential in my work, the ice is actually a mineral, and it's actually something which you can look back thousands of years, but at the same time it's having its own agency and dynamic which kind of relate to our time perception. So you will hear it, you will see it move, it will crack, it will fold. So the glacier is extremely active. It's probably the only mineral which is really active in the sense of, actively like us as being. And so you can really kind of sense this broader picture of a timeline. And I like the image of thinking about the glacier or the ice cap as an oracle, and really, like you can drill deep down into the ice sheet to understand the past and kind of release the trapped bubble of ancient atmosphere. And doing that, you can probably foresee the future. And at the same time, you're standing on the ice, which become a mirror, a magnifying glass, which kind of like explain about the present, but in a more acute and more urgent way. Because as we know, like both polar regions are actually, the tendency of global warming is much stronger at the extremities, at both poles. So they become kind of like an experimental space to like understand what will happen to other regions of the Earth. So you're like standing in the now, looking in the past and forcing the future. So it's kind of the idea of like the ice as the oracle. And that's something obviously which I tend to kind of translate within some of the pieces, mostly maybe towards North Pole, which is the centerpiece of the show.
Well, let's take a look at some of these and we can kind of unpack what you've set up here with examples from the show. So the first we'll show actually is probably the only that doesn't relate to the glacier landscape at all, but is such an amazing way to start the exhibition. So this is a video, a film, and beneath it flows liquid fire. Why don't you tell us a little bit about this piece?
Well, for me, it was very important to bring this piece at the beginning of the show because it's the piece which had the greatest contrast to the rest. And somehow it's kind of like almost stressful, urgent piece. You're coming in this space and you look at a fountain actually burning, but at the same time water is flowing. So it's not that one element take over the other. It's like this mix of elemental forces within one picture. And there's like evoking a lot of different association, right? That I don't have to explain. But then for the starting of the show, for me, it was kind of like, it's very present and local, and it's a performance, but at the same time, you also relate to kind of the beginning of society. So humankind had to tame the fire in order to dominate its environment. And then it also had to have the water, so we need to dig down to kind of find fresh water in order to create in order to have what we need as a milestone to bring up like society and to build society. And eventually when we have enough water, like the exuberance of water, we actually create a fountain, which is just about the celebration of wells, like other wells somehow. And then the fire, again, which I think is very interesting, and it's mostly interesting, in the United States, we know it very much, fire is getting out of control. So now today we could just even say, well, people are talking about the Anthropocene, but we could also talk about the Pyrocene, the moment where the fire that we tame actually release itself and become its own agent. It's not under control anymore, and it's actually really having a huge impact in the way we engage with our surrounding, because today you wouldn't build the house you have been building it maybe 50 years ago. You will have to kind of think about, okay, where is the fire, or where the fire could come from. And so I think that was kind of a nice entry into the show. And at the same time, it's also related to the hidden part. And beneath it all flows liquid fire. It relates to tectonic activity. It relates to magma. It relates to processes which are hidden beneath and that we're not aware of, but which actually sculpt the world we're living in. And so I think that this piece is really kind of playing with this different momentum, trying to actually compress them into one image. So and it's an image which is somehow somewhat ominous, uncanny, maybe uncomfortable for someone to be in the space. But the longer you look, the more mesmerizing it becomes, which is very important. And then you pass behind this first encounter, and you're in the main gallery, which is extremely crystalline.
Yeah.
And on your left hand, you have the fountain just in front of the museum. So it was kind of like a very obvious decision to put the fountain in the show, and then to actually bring the outside world within the kind of narrative layer of the show itself. So I think that we discussed it, and I think that's
also in terms of just situating this in terms of the visitor's perspective, that this is in a way what we most relate to as being a very human element, that the fountain is something that's, like, as you said, it's the symbol of civilization, really. Going back to like Roman times and building a city, you put a fountain in the middle of it, and that means that you're bringing water from far outside and able to create a city around it. So I think it kind of focuses us in, our world for a minute. But as you said, there's something very uncanny about it. There's something very urgent about it. And I hadn't actually made the connection until you just made it, to these kind of omnipresent fires that we're seeing in California, really encroaching back on civilization, like you said, that there's only so much we can really control. And the cities that we've planned for ourselves and where we've kind of stuck that border between, human and the wild, is really starting to unfold. Yeah. And it's creating, of course, a lot of anxiety. But I think that there's so much ambiguity, I think, in that image, and so much beauty as well. So let's look at what we'll see as you beautifully explained when we enter the main space. So there's 5 series in total in the exhibition. This is on the back main wall, a series of photographs called the Blue Fossil and Tropic Stories. And this might be, is this the earliest piece in the show?
Yeah, actually it is, yes.
So this, you actually appear in this work. So a lot of times I think the human is almost like only alluded to, but we actually have you in very small scale, but here on top of an iceberg, and you are trying to melt the iceberg actually with a blowtorch. So we have a very kind of absurdist, almost performative gesture that I guess is enacting some of the things that you show in other ways. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the inspiration for this piece.
Well, inspiration is the first encounter with the Arctic landscape in 2011 as I was traveling to Iceland for the very first time, and where for the very first time kind of re-encounter glacial landscape. I'm from Switzerland, so somehow the Alps were in my backyard and I was going in a mountain, and I had the feeling I knew glacier, I knew this type of landscape. But then I traveled to Iceland and I really had a hard time to figure out what I was looking at, and that's something which is so particular to both polar region, is that once you're standing there and looking at the scenery, you never really can relate to it in terms of scale and size, and you completely lost this sensing. So there's like this destabilization, this moment where you actually kind of lost in time and space, because time and space relate to the body, and there you're looking at the horizon line, but you cannot really relate to the horizon line because there's nothing in the middle that you can recognize. So a rock can be huge or small, an iceberg can be huge or small, but you never know, is it really huge or is it just really close or is it really far? And so you kind of need to recalibrate all your senses to this particular place. And that was, like very striking for me, and led like a very strong feeling, which I would say was kind of embodied. I really like the click, and then I knew that I will be. I was walking outside, and I knew that I will engage more deeply in a relation with this type of landscape, because I could learn so much being lost. One need to first understand that it's lost to find its way. So, and eventually, 2 years later, I went back. And I went back with like an idea that I wanted to implement, and this idea was to actually use the kind of frame, the scenery, and the aesthetic that we inherit from the Romantic era. And I think you have a good example with the iceberg from church upstairs. So I really wanted to get into this aesthetic, but reverse the kind of dissociation. Like the Romantic is always about dissociating the viewer from the viewed, like the object of observation from the observer, and mankind being this kind of like other agent, not being part of the bigger picture. And in this work, I wanted to reconciliate mankind with its surrounding, but also to try to show how precarious this reconciliation will be or is. And I decided to climb on an iceberg, and it was not really about me and the bravado of the endeavor. It was really about putting a silhouette, which became this kind of projection space where each of us could actually become this little figure on top of the iceberg and just think, like, I am on the iceberg. What it mean to melt down the ice under my feet? What it mean to be in the world and with the world as a being, and how can I solve this problem? And it became these 3 images, which are somehow comic on one hand and very tragic on the others, but it really was about the individuum, but not about my individuality, just about each of us being able to actually project oneself into this kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think that's so important because the scale of climate change is so overwhelming that very rarely can we conceive ourselves as agents at all. But of course, we're all agents and our actions are cumulative. But there's never that one-to-one connection between our actions and the recipient of our actions.
Yeah, it's so complicated, it's so abstract, it's so complicated to actually think that when you're sleeping and you let your phone on, that's actually energy and resources which are kind of getting taken. I mean, even when you know all of that, it's almost impossible to really relate. So I think that was kind of like my reaction on that.
But it's so interesting what you were describing too before, is that the iceberg is kind of also the great, foe, the great counterpart to that, because it is something that we can also see as having its own agency. It's very much in some ways, at the whims of what happens in terms of, the larger, kind of global climate, impact. But it's something that also, as you said, it moves. It has agency, it melts, it's reflective kind of our own actions. So it is really this great kind of parallel.
Yeah, and on top of it, what we don't know and what I didn't know before I actually experienced those landscapes is each of the iceberg, even if they're melting away, so they're kind of like decaying, but this decay support a world for itself. So underneath, under the surface of the water, the fresh water being released attract algae, attract like a full ecosystem which actually building underneath, and then you only discover once it's flipped. And that's for me was like I didn't knew about that before, and to really think about each of those iceberg as a kind of like island of life, a life support system somehow, was really also very striking. And we normally always, we normally not, but we always relate to them as kind of like this, relatively inert and dead kind of piece of ice just being moved by the seawater or pushed by the glacier. But actually the glacier is calving, is giving birth. And I think that this giving birth is so beautiful, and it's actually really giving birth to a full life support system, and the bigger and the greater the icebergs are, and the more life you will find underneath. And it's something that I've been getting into the diving, and I will definitely engage with the hidden phase of the iceberg, which anyway is nice because we always think about the tip.
Sure.
Yeah.
So we'll get, I think, much more into what you're speaking of when we discuss the film, Towards No Earthly Pole. But here is another example that I think is a good segue of the moving, potential, the literal moving potential of the glacier environment. So this is a series of work called Not All Who Wander Are Lost. We're very lucky to have one of these pieces enter our permanent collection here at the DMA. So I'll show a couple examples as we're speaking. But this is a glacial erratic rock that you've done a great intervention to create a sculpture. So this is the glacier erratic, if I understand correctly, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is a naturally occurring phenomenon whereby a glacier moves a rock a very long distance. And so it's then found somewhere that's very far from its point of origin, which gives it the title erratic. So literally, again, this kind of moving potential, the agency of the glacier environment. But you've done a really specific intervention to the piece. So maybe you can describe how you make the sculpture.
Sure. Well, the whole show is about this different state of the material and how can we read them. And erratic for me always has been fascinating, because once you are evolving into one landscape and you encounter those rocks, they just seem so static and so stable, and you kind of like even orientate while evolving. And if you know, and one might know, they actually have been moved around, they're unrooted, as you were saying, they're just misplaced, and they became this kind of cultural agent, just like showing a different part of the world, but in a particular space. So what I wanted to do is like to give them this velocity or this dynamic, to bring this dynamic back, because somehow they're just waiting there, and eventually a next ice age or a flood will move them a tiny bit forward. So they're just in this kind of like space of waiting. And I decide to bring them in another journey, and then to take them in the museum, and then to bring the emphasis on their kind of fluidity. I core drill them, and I place the drill core underneath the stone itself, kind of giving this feeling of rotation. They could roll on their own material. And eventually drill coring is also something which is recurring into my work, because it's a lot about like extraction and mining, but also about understanding. So in order to kind of project ourselves into deep geological time, we need to core drill, and that's the image of the oracle. But the same thing we can do with the stone. And so we go down in order to open a book. And so each of the core, for me, they're kind of like these pages of the book, and then they lay down in the horizontality. And the horizontality is actually the opposite. That's a very cultural way of describing history, while the geology is always vertical. The world is like, we're adding layers, but we always make a line with like something in the middle and an arrow at the end. And so those actually know on their own substances, and you have these different metals in between, which on one hand refer to extraction, but on the other they also really refer to the direction that humankind as a new geological forces is actually bringing into a broader system. So we have like the Iron Age, we have the Bronze Age. We have these different material which also give name to different eras, and these eras are actually momentum where society developed. But the development of society was always based onto a primer material being newly extracted, and this extraction will bring new tools, and the new tools will bring new understanding of the world around us, which will change the way society reflects itself, as well as like the kind of like philosophical understanding of society. And so so that's kind of like this balance between this stone, which is somehow a world for itself. For me, they're also like planets, but they become being. I mean, some will even see like deep sea creature, like crawling around the exhibition space.
Core drawing too brings to mind coral.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of visual resonances between, those extremities too. And entire ecosystems, I think when you were talking about, you have to, kind of get into the iceberg to understand the life that it supports. So also the idea of drilling into something to understand the larger context of it. So there's the positive side of kind of the scientific exploration, but also, how we exploit that, as you mentioned, in terms of, human exploitation for economic gain, which has driven a lot of this activity. And then I'm showing here a slide of Trapezema. So this is, in our show, a series of 3 vitrines. This is, I think a real crowd favorite. It's so beautiful. So I think also, so much of this work, the glacier erratics too, have this really seductive quality almost to it. So even though there's this, really urgent message, at first I think grabs you at the level of something that's very beautiful and very seductive. But the more you think about it, or even after you spend that split second processing the image, there's something also, deeply wrong here that I think is the next layer of understanding. So why don't you talk a little bit about Trapezema?
Yeah, I mean, Trapezema is kind of like a work from 2015, which not directly relate to the rest of the show, I think, but which was just from its materiality so important to have, because a lot of the show, we're talking about erratic, we're talking about like the performance on the iceberg, and we will be talking about Tours en Asipo, which is kind of the main piece which give the title to the show. So everywhere, somewhere, you have this ice as kind of like an ID, an agent, but it's never there. So,
right.
And then I think that while we were discussing the show, we had this kind of like, okay, how can we bring also the ice into the show? And I had this somewhat older piece, Trapezema, where you encounter those plants which have been deep into liquid nitrogen, and through the process of freezing into liquid nitrogen, they get this ice crystal on them, and that's again is like this relation of like sheet of ice, one sheet after another. So you kind of like, it's almost as you will push like this kind of like temporality of the plants with expand through the ice. And then what you see at the end of the show is like these three different plants which are extremely denaturalized, so they don't even look like plants. They could be a lot of different things, but I like to think about it as kind of like almost a topology of the plant itself, because of all these layers, as it was on one plant but maybe like 1,000 plants, and it becomes the idea or an abstraction of the idea of the plant itself. And those plants, first of all, it's nice to have them because they bring like something more, you know, like organic and botanic within the show, which is a good, I think, a good counterpart. And at the same time, there are plants which survive the last great extinction 66 million years ago, and which are actually growing in the Great South, and which have been brought, through Western colonization to our part of the world, and which kind of end up being like the most gregarious and common plant that one will find everywhere. But they have this great history. They're like panchronic. They have been, going through all these different moments, and they're still around. And I think that for me was like to actually creationize them was to kind of bring them out of the time or out of like their present, and they're kind of floating between life and death as a kind of like a memento mori of what happened to them before. And obviously they're also like, they have this kind of ghost-like presence, and I'm also showing, well, like the strong relation and the strong kind of I'm looking for the word, but
interrelation?
Well, the fact that actually they could not sustain without us right now. I mean, interdependence. So we're depending on them, but they also depend on us, and in this case, very much they depend to electricity, because their life support system is actually exactly. So I think that it was kind of like a way to engage with different timelines, and also a way to bring like the ice, and they're just in front of like some other plants which are in the back outside of the museum, and the fountain. So it's really about this different state of water as a material. And I think that's
I really like the idea that these are, very common plants in places like offices or, in our own homes. And, the idea of, they've kind of been domesticated, like, as you said, they've been brought into, the human environment, and really show a whole, history of, colonial actions, as you said, too, that these, tend to come from, the global South, but then are very ubiquitous in Europe, where they might not have been, or in North America, where they might not have been native. So that these plants tell a story that ultimately reflects back on us and our human actions, which I think is a through line, of course, of all of your work. And also, just the something being wrong here of the great contrast between a tropical plant and a deep freeze, which I think is another way that is a way for us to understand that, understand in our own lives when we have an unexpected frost, that something just isn't aligned, correctly. So I do think that it, again, is a way to put this on a more understandable, kind of humanized scale of these like larger shifts that, have been going on for a very long time. But of course are accelerating now. Yes, very beautiful work. So this was very fun to install.
Yeah, that was actually the fun part, yeah.
So I hope you stay tuned to see our social media to see how this process underwent. But dipping in liquid nitrogen is its own really great dramatic effect, but comes up with this really, really beautiful response. So this is the titular piece of the show, Towards No Earthly Pole. So this and the erotics were done in the past year. So this is almost a collage of footage that you've taken at many different sites in the Alpine region, also in the Arctic region, really beautifully shot. So you have taken a drone that is 2 drones, I guess a drone with a camera and a drone with a spotlight, to capture footage of these glaciers at night. So it's very otherworldly, but also very, I think, you spoke about its relationship with the history of photography and, you know, kind of the formal elements of how images are constructed, specifically with light. So I wondered if first maybe we would start with how it relates to this history, and then we can talk a little bit about some of its resonances.
Well, I mean, I think that I don't know if it's related directly to history, but maybe before I'm getting into the history of photography, where I think which very, very important for this work is actually the fact that over the course of the last, like maybe 10 years, Arctic or Antarctic image making or imagery became very broadly broadcasted, so broadly and so intensively due to the global climate crisis that they become like a little bit a cliche of themselves. I think I don't know. I mean, you cannot stand one more polar bear starving, and it's terrible because we should like have this kind of empathy to it. But I think that there've been so much of it, like it's kind of like the overexposition have a counter effect. And for me, I really wanted to kind of try to create an alternative way of describing a place which has been broadly exposed, and the night, the Arctic polar night, is completely underexposed. It's actually almost like a blackout. It's right. Kind of like no one is really have been describing it. But then again, if you're going into the history of photography and you go back even to the history of explorations photography, then you start to have greater example. And I think that one of the greater photographer, Frank Hurley, which was on the South Pole expedition with Shackleton, the Endurance, which actually is the greatest success of a failure. They never reached anything, but eventually they didn't die, and therefore the expedition was a great success. But he was like 18 months on the Antarctic ice cap, and he was actually experimenting with magnesium flash, and in the depths of the Antarctic night, kind of staging somehow this element which never have been really seen by the public before. And I think that it was very interesting, the type of staging, and then to kind of think about the landscape as a darkroom. So because normally you're going out, taking the pictures and bringing them back and developing them. But as you develop them, you are actually having this direct interaction with the light and the chemical. But he will just see the landscape and go with the light and try to design or to manipulate the landscape. And so that's something which interests me a lot. And then another great interest, which actually is a key component of the piece, is actually the elevation of human sites. So I think that in the 30 years I have been here in the world, we saw like a great expansion of the sites, which start like in the 90s with like the Earth from above, like all this coffee table book, and then end up being Google Earth, Google Maps, and now like almost any image that we consume, because it's really about consumption, is actually mediated through a machine, through a robot, through something which have nothing to do with like the scale of our body, and which is very, very often from above. So that means that the way we relate to image and the way we build our world, like each image being kind of like an atom, and each atom creating a molecule, and all these molecules create like a broader atmosphere of a visual culture. For this one, the visual culture of the pole, I wanted to kind of deconstruct that. So I wanted to kind of see how in the process I can mimic what we normally do in our brain, or like with our understanding of a place. And we always kind of, I mean, for the pole and even more for the South Pole, you know, there is no population. So no one has been dreaming the space. So it's actually only hard science, natural science, we brought a few images back. And on these images, we're actually building a reality. And this reality is that precise that almost each of us have the feeling they know how it look like.
Yeah.
I mean, some misplace the polar bear and the penguin, right? But you kind of like define a strict place, and I want to kind of like deconstruct this place, and that's why I actually try to make this digital collage where each of the take, first of all, show a place that we think we know but we never experienced, and show it in a new light. And this new light is like this drone and the eyes, so using the reflection of the eyes and using the presence of the eyes itself. So it's not about staging, it's about giving a voice. So it's really about the eyes becoming an actor, the eyes, you know, like and embodying his kind of like agency within the film. But obviously I help out with the light. And then it's about sculpting with light. So that's related to photography. It's about like, how can I bring an iceberg back to the gallery? It's impossible. It's just way too large. So how can I, as the iceberg being like the ultimate sculpture of some sort, how can I actually engage with it? And it was a very intuitive relationship. So we go and you will actually fly the drone and try to reveal something, try to reveal the secret of the landscape hidden in the dark. And then all these different images, I will stack them. So what you actually see in the exhibition space is a collage, but it's a collage which is, again, with this different layer. And the camera is kind of like going from one layer to the other, and you never really lose the space, but you basically flying from Antarctic over Switzerland into Greenland and Iceland without having the feeling that you're actually changing space. So I'm tricking somehow this kind of cliche in the way we have to readjust our understanding of space, and using the darkness in order to do this, to do this trick somehow. And so at the end, it's a very dreamy but somewhat uncanny encounter with a new place and a new light.
Yeah, there's, a lot there to unpack. When I first saw the drone, kind of using the drone as a spotlight too, I feel like gives a great honesty in a way that you know that this is being framed, by, even though the drone itself, of course, is robotic, but being framed ultimately by someone. And I think in the, the 19th century kind of romantic landscape that was at service of a lot of these expeditions, the view that you got was this kind of almost like a view of God or something, where there's such a disconnect between, the artist who's manipulating this and then the end product that you see. And so here you have such a conscientious framing of what you're seeing because you're seeing the drone spotlight. So I think that it, in some ways, really lifts the veil on that. But then the end product is still, as you said, completely disorienting and otherworldly, because we still can't ever really comprehend, I think, the subject matter. So there's an honesty in that too, that it's not something, in the 19th century kind of paradigm, that post-Enlightenment paradigm, that everything can be dissected and understood. I think there's still great reverence for what's always going to be unknowable, even though, there have been great, scientific, efforts to try to explain this, that there's always something that's out of your reach, something that you can't quite understand. So I think that it's working on both of those registers, which is really beautiful. This was such a kind of feat in its own right to take this footage. I wonder if you want to speak a little bit just about, how you go on these journeys and what the process is like to get this footage.
The kind of like moment which really bring me to the, that I try to distill and recreate into the movie is actually momentum that I had while being on a scientific vessel for the first Antarctic Biennale. and going from Ushuaia over the Drake Passage to the Antarctic Peninsula. And there was like a night where we were on the upper deck, and we were just there with the captain and the curator, and we would be looking outside into this emptiness of the darkness of the Antarctic night, and the boat will just be going, and we will have like all these different tools to actually sense without sensing, because that's a digression, but I kind of like the idea that a lot of the sensing that we use to understand places that we can reach is actually through sound, but then there's visualize. So it's actually sound visualized, like all the sonars and every of these tools. So we had like all these panels, because you need to avoid the iceberg while going to Antarctica, right? And on the other hand, just next to the captain, there was one of the cruise member, which was actually maneuvering a big light. And he was actually going left and right and really scanning into the night of the Antarctic. And just, because you never know if one of the panels is just not working right, and just scanning for iceberg. But there's nothing coming. And it was like a stormy night. It was really opaque, and the snow was going. And I think that's that's the opening picture of the film, is actually this snow where you kind of completely lose sense of what you're looking at. Are those particles? Are we breaking the speed of light? I mean, you don't know what it is. And that was kind of the feeling. But at some point, he just went left with this light, and it felt like being on a theater stage by the, looking over the shoulder of the light regie, and he turned the light, and at this moment there was like this incredible, amazing, humongous iceberg which is coming out, and for one little moment this huge mass, which had like this kind of like extreme intense like gravitational force, I would say, was kind of like standing still. And that's a feeling that you have when you're in the train, and if you have two trains going past one another, you never really know, is my train going or is the other train, and where's this kind of like relation of movement. And that was the same moment, like, is that the iceberg moving or the boat, and it just disappeared. And this was kind of like a very strong, it led just a very strong impression on me. And then I was there, and I was trying to kind of like understand more how could I use that into an artwork, because I saw it was bringing such a presence and such a voice to this iceberg that I really wanted to kind of try to find a way to do it. And then eventually it happened to be a 3 years long project, which is much more complicated than that. But then we eventually developed the technology, because it's not as easy as I was thinking at the beginning to fly a drone by minus 30 degrees Celsius. So I first had to kind of like understand that. In order to do that, I went to the Alps with a drone, and I figured out that it was not exactly possible the way I was expecting it. And then I developed the technology. While developing the technology, I had to develop kind of my ability to, like survive into this kind of beautiful but unhospitable landscape, rather a style, I would even say. And also then to kind of think about how could I be there with the team. So I went and conquered Greenland, and then tried to see if I could camp, if I could trust myself, and trust also myself with people and bringing people there, because when you're working with 2 drones, you need at least like 4 people working on the drone, and then you need like a 5th at least, which is just taking care of the data and the electricity. And it happened that we end up doing months of shooting with an incredible team, and that was it was one of the greatest moments of my life. I felt so alive while doing that, and at the same time it felt so strange, because we were working with the very, very like high-end technology, last generation of everything we could have, from camera to drone, and at the same time we were just like living in a tent, chopping ice from the glacier, trying to melt it, and sometimes the gas cooker was not working because it was just too cold. So the only thing we had was like an electric water cooker, and we could not like heat up our food, so we only had like the yum soups, and that was kind of the way we were surviving. So it was, and we were carrying everything by sled, and so it was really this kind of huge contrast between the reality of us in the landscape and us trying to actually capture this landscape in an image. And I think that's something which was for me, like striking and writing that maybe not translates into the piece, but it's somehow very important for the piece and the way we kind of engage with the landscape.
Well, I think this is a really beautiful way to leave it, Julian. We are so excited to have you here and have your exhibition open May 2nd. It's going to be such an amazing treat for audiences. I know it will bring up so many important conversations. So we hope to see everyone here at the Dallas Museum of Art to check out Concentrations.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited too, after 3 years actually, and a little bit of viruses in the meantime. I'm so happy that we actually can open this show together. Thank you so much.